Welcome. That's not how I start my videos. Welcome. Sup and welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you like talking all things bookish with me here, feel free to like and subscribe. Today I'm going to be going over all the books that I read in February. Except, honestly, it's not all the books I read in February because, again, I read way too many books for just one video. I'm going to be splitting it up because I read a lot of romance reads because it was Valentine's Day, and it just so happened that my library was forcing all of the romance books that I had put requests on like months ago. They were like, they're ready now. So I leaned into it. That's going to be in a different video. Right now I'm going to talk about all of the other non-romance books that I read in February. In February, I read about 6,984 pages. I had 0 DNFs. Of that, I'm going to be talking about just over 4,700 pages, which is 16 books. And I'll be going in order of the books I loved the most, all the way down to the ones that I maybe didn't quite so like. So let's just get into it.
Begin.
So I gave the Bands of Mourning 5 stars. This is the last currently released in the Wax and Wane series, which is Mistborn Era 2 by Brandon Sanderson. I read Mistborn Era 1 back in December, and then I read Mistborn Era 2, as far as it's been released right now, in mostly January, and then just this little one that snuck into February, and I loved it. I think that it's very different from Mistborn Era 1, which is a lot more serious and grandiose. There's epic things happening, there's a Lord Ruler, there's prophecy, and all of that sort of thing. And this one is more like shooty cowboys and a lot of sense of humor. It's very, very light, especially in comparison. The books are about half as long, there's a ton of levity and jokes thrown in there, and I love the characters in this a lot. In the first series, I really liked all of the world building and the setup and payoff, and in this series, it's honestly the characters and the humor that really draw me in. This one is probably my favorite in the Wax and Wane series so far. I love that we have somebody who just dresses up in a lot of disguises and is really obsessed with hats, and also in this one he seemed to be obsessed with nuts as well. One of my favorite bits is somebody who's kind of bringing back the vibes of that first series and talking about this big grand thing that's happening, and the whole room is just silent and stunned, and then, you know, we have our jokester over in the corner who just throws a nut at the dude's head like, oh, I'm sorry, like, I didn't know someone could honestly be that serious. I had to throw a nut at you just to make sure you were real. And so that was just so much fun. I really enjoyed myself. Obviously, it's pretty far along in the series, so there's not much I can say without giving away any kind of spoilers, but definitely pick it up. It's a lot of fun.
Anyone who says differently is selling something.
I also gave a 5 to Where the Drowned Girls Go. This is the most recent entry in Wayward Children, which is one of my absolute favorite series by one of my absolute favorite authors. I love that in this one we got to stay inside of the school again, but this time we're going to the other school. It's kind of like the dark school. It's the counterpart to Eleanor's school for wayward children. And it was really, really well done. I think that this one has the potential to draw in people who haven't already liked the series so far because it has a very episodic nature, and this one is the setup to what I think is going to be a payoff in book 8, 9, or 10, or possibly all of them. But we're definitely setting up plot points, we're setting up things to have like a grand impact and change on the world and like an ongoing storyline. So I really enjoyed this one, and I think it was a great entry. I also gave 5 stars to Pet. This is one of those books that I had for a while because it was like I was getting a bunch of books online, and if you meet a certain threshold then you have free shipping, and I'd rather buy a book than pay the same amount in shipping. So I'd heard good things, I threw it in, and then I hadn't read it, and oh my god, it was so fantastic. I don't think I have a single bad thing to say about it. I will say though, I dual read this one with the physical and then the audiobook, and the audiobook is so excellent. This has a ton of dialogue that's very like dialect, and having the narrator being able to put on the different accents and inflections and ways that those characters would say those words 100% made the difference. It was so very well done. I loved all the voices. I love the inclusivity of this as well. Our main character is a trans girl, but aside from that being kind of the background on who she is, it doesn't really matter in the story. And what I found a lot more interesting is how they included that she doesn't like to talk. In fact, it took her many years of her life before she even spoke her first word, and therefore she, her family, her best friend, and even some of her best friend's family all learned to speak sign language to be able to communicate with her. And there are a lot of times she doesn't like to yell. If she can avoid it, she 100% will. And sometimes she even just does a video chat on the phone because she doesn't want to talk. She wants to be able to gesture and sign and that sort of thing. So I found that really interesting, and it's not something I've read a lot about, especially I think this is the first time I've ever read it in a fiction work. And I love Pet. I love how they're depicted and the way that they speak, the way that they influence people and their actions around them. I thought it was a really interesting way to look at some pretty heavy subject matter, especially in a way that, like, at least teens, if not maybe even kids, would be able to read this book and manage through it. But it was so beautiful and excellently done. The only reason it's not higher on this list is because it's not really my preferred genre. It leans a little bit more magical realism, but excellent. Super fantastic book.
That was brilliant.
And then I gave a 5 to Invisible Women. This is a nonfiction read, and it's about the data bias that is inherent in our culture and also just other cultures around the world. I already was pretty familiar with some of the subject matter. One of my favorite online articles that I have like bookmarked and send out to people all the time is about all of the different ways that the world is designed by and for men. Even things that you don't really consider, like the standard temperature that we set our office buildings to is designed for a man. And men have more muscle, they run a little bit hotter on average, but also the type of clothing that they wear to the office is thicker and more layers, whereas women's office attire is a little bit flimsier, and that's why women tend to get cold at the office and they'll have like a coat there or something. Or the way that women suffer more and more severe injuries from car accidents because the dummies that we're using to test and see if the car is safe are made for a 50% male. There's not anything related to a female body in that testing.
Shame.
So it was just a lot of things like that, and she broke it up in all of the different chapters into different segments. One of the chapters that I liked the most was about transportation, and it's very interesting to see how it plays out. Because she's from the UK, a lot of her examples will come from London, but in that chapter in particular, she included America, she included Scandinavia, she included India, and all of these different countries are experiencing issues with their transportation, just maybe in slightly different ways. So, for example, the people who run the transportation are typically men, and they're going to organize things in a way that more reflects the type of world and life that they know. And men are more likely to commute from their home into the city center for work, whereas women are more often going to be the people who are going neighborhood to neighborhood and doing all of those little errands and chores. They're also more likely to be the caregivers of both children, the sick, and the elderly. And so they use transportation in a way that's different to men. When you go from one outer point into the city center, all of that transportation is usually very fast, very covered, but the other type of work, you have to have like workarounds for it because it could be set up for women, but it's not.
It flames on the side of my face.
And taking into account things like how they're more likely to have a wheelchair or a stroller with them, and how that matters for sidewalks and getting on buses and if it fits. And so it was just very interesting taking a look at that and understanding all the different ways that we could change and we could be able to collect this data and use it in our benefit to improve society as a whole. I'm definitely thinking about picking this one up because it had just so many good details that I feel like I want to refer back to them in future. And my last 5-star would probably be at the top, but it's a reread, so that doesn't really seem fair, and that's The Library at Mount Char. I love this book. I read it at the end of last year, and it really took me by surprise because I wasn't really expecting anything from it, and then holy crap, I love it so much. They're making a really fancy illustrated version coming out soon, and so I wanted to read this, be able to place an order if I'm like, okay, I do really like this book, because it's too much money, and I already have my floppy paperback copy that I love, so it's like, do I really want to own 2 copies? Is it gonna matter to me that much? But like, I do love this book so much. It's one of my favorites, so yeah, I'm gonna do it.
Yes.
But this is a book it's kind of 2 different books smushed together, and I normally remember a lot more about the first book and then like the very end of the second half, but there's a lot in there, and the first half is kind of setting up all of these dominoes and then watching them fall. It's got a lot of action, it's got a lot of snark, and then the second half is a lot more actually in the library itself, which I kind of totally forgot. People will be like, oh, this is a library, it's a book about books. And I'm like, is it though? I don't, are you sure? Because mostly what I'm thinking about is all of the interesting questions that it raises about what is a god? How do you make a god? Should we have a god? What is their responsibility to the world around them? Just like so many interesting layers, and I absolutely love it. I also really like the protagonist. Normally I don't relate super hard to protagonists, but this one is such a quirky and interesting character. She always wears gold biker shorts and she has like a Christmas sweater year round, and so much confidence, so much like wit and sass, and she's so clever, and I love that. I love reading about a character who's confident and who is competent and just able to set up the world around them. This book also has one of my all-time favorite jokes, which is honestly kind of just a throwaway line, but for some reason it sticks in my head so hard and I love it so much. I also think it's really funny that the author, I looked him up on Goodreads, and this is the only fiction that he's put out. He's put out a lot of books, but they're all like Apache and Linux and programming things, and then he just wrote this one really wild, super gory fantasy, sci-fi, horror, whatever, and then I guess he got it out of his system. It was a story he needed to tell, he told it, and then he never published again. But I love it so, so much. I'm so glad he put it out into the world, and I can't wait for the fancy edition. I also read Another Kind. This is a book I gave 4.5. It's a graphic novel series. It's more like middle grade, and we're following along with a bunch of children who are supernatural creatures. So we've got a Yeti, a will-o'-the-wisp, a kid who can transform into a bear, kind of like a lizard man alien type of kid, Selkie, who is mute as well, and then a little girl who is probably like the daughter of Cthulhu or something. And this was just really fun. I love the art style. That's what really sold me on it. And I think that the stories are fairly well done. I didn't have any major complaints and I was following along and caring about the plot. I like the inclusivity of it. One of the author illustrators is a non-binary person themselves, and so they have like a little entry at one point in the book where they learn about what those terms are, what it is to be they, them, and one of the characters kind of realizes, oh, I think that might relate to me, and I thought it was handled really well. I also liked the way that the kids interact with each other, especially because the older kids tend to handle a lot of the decision making and everything going on, and they try to keep the younger kids a little bit more sheltered, but when the little kids want to participate, it's like, yeah, this affects you too, we'll come to a decision together. And so I just liked it. I had a fun time. I thought the ending was really great and hopeful, and it was a lot of fun. And then the last book is not quite in my upper reaches of books for the month, but Spy X Family was a really good time. I love that it's a spy and he has to infiltrate this elite school, and so he has to form like a fake family, and he adopts a little girl who turns out to be a telepath. Good boy, buddy. And he ends up married to a woman who's an assassin. And so everybody in this family has their own reasons for keeping their secret life, but also for wanting to be a member of this family. And it's so much fun. There's this guy he's like a headmaster at the school they're trying to get into, and his whole personality type is literally just elegance. And he's just constantly screaming, elegant! And it was a blast. I really enjoyed this one. Now we're getting into more of the middle territory for books, and I gave Senlin Ascends like a 3.75. It was interesting, and I really enjoy the writing style of the author. And I love all of the flashbacks and the way that he characterizes the wife. But I felt a little confused and meandering throughout, especially because there was one part of the tower that we spent like 100 pages in, and I did not know what was going on or what kind of relevance or anything that it had. It was just kind of like we got distracted and sidetracked, and then all of a sudden we would go to other places and spend way less time there on those like story beats. So it's a little bit messy, and I'm not quite sure what I'm expecting out of it, but I do really enjoy the writing style, and I'm gonna keep going on with the series. I gave a 3.5 to The Light Fantastic. I think this was a little bit easier to get through than The Color of Magic because while I have seen the movies a lot of times, there were more moments I felt in The Light Fantastic that were omitted from the screenplay. And I love that we got more luggage. Like, there's so many instances where the masters of the luggage are in danger, and so the luggage will just sit out on the road with its mouth open, just like, ah. And then there's a ton of gold in it, so it attracts people to be like, oh, we gotta go get that luggage. And then by the time they get to where the luggage was, it's just further up the road, like, gold? Would you like some gold? And they're like, yeah, I want the gold. And so it's just like teasing them and pulling them along the road so it can actually get help for the people who need it. And it's so much fun. I want more of the luggage in everything. Yeah, that's basically it. I love the luggage. I also read The Blade itself, and this is the first in the First Law trilogy. I'm going through the whole series this year, at least the whole first trilogy. And this one was tough for me. I was listening to it on audiobook and reading along, and I kept realizing that I was zoning out in between. I'm a really fast-paced, plot-driven reader, and this is a slow-paced, character-driven book. So I wasn't really connecting with it very well, and I kept realizing that in all of those kind of silences where nothing is happening in between, my mind was just wandering, and then I'd have listened and read along with this whole big part, but I couldn't actually tell you what I was reading. So I reread the first third or so of the book like 3 times, and then finally my audiobook from the library expired. But luckily I managed to find it on YouTube, and because it was on YouTube and not Libby, I was able to read it at 4 times speed. And as it turned out, that was the key for me.
Faster. Faster. Faster.
I just needed to be able to read this at a faster pace so that I didn't have as much time in between for my mind to wander. And I quite liked it. I'm not super invested in the main characters, and I don't think there was a lot of plot in this book. I did like the tower location that we go to, the House of the Maker. I thought that was super cool and definitely plays right into the type of thing I like to read about. And I liked several of the secondary characters. I didn't feel like they were given as much time, but their storylines are a lot more interesting to me, so I'm hoping that we'll get to see more of them. Plus, overall, I know that this book was written like 15 years ago or something, and he's definitely been improving as a writer and putting out newer books. So I'm excited to see where we go from here. Now that the band is all together, so to speak, I think that we'll definitely have a lot more plot and I can get more into the later entries. And I finished out all of the prequels to A Master of Jinn. So I read The Haunting of Tram Car 015. I also gave this one a 3.5. I think it was okay.
Sometimes I say okay instead of fine.
It definitely wasn't as good as the really short novelette of A Dead Jinn in Cairo. I thought he did an excellent job with the medium in that one, and I was expecting a lot more from this, especially being 4 times longer. But the main character is very bland. He doesn't have any personality. He doesn't have any impact even on the story. He's just kind of like a man who's in charge and present, and the characters around him are the ones who are interesting or doing things that affect the plot. I did like that they were able to tie the main monster of the week into kind of what's going on in the scenery around them, but this one was just okay. It had a couple of jokes and I did like the little humorous elements, but it wasn't like super impactful or memorable or anything. Then I gave a 3 to A Shadow in Summer. I was expecting a lot more from this one, especially because it's supposed to be one of the big heavy hitters for fantasy, and I didn't really feel like there were that many fantastical elements. I know that there's a supernatural being in this, and maybe I just forgot about it, but anything fantastical that managed to happen, I don't remember it at all. I didn't like the main plot line that we're following along with. I found the characters okay, and I did like the initial bit where we start off in the monastery. I thought that everything that was happening there was super interesting. But overall, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about this series. I've heard that it's really fantastic, and I definitely want to finish the whole thing. But at least for book 1, it didn't hook me.
The heck you say?
I also gave a 3 to The Female of the Species. I owned the copy in physical, and so I was planning to dual read, and I just ended up immersing with the audiobook instead, which I think was the better move on this one. I feel like if I had read it physically as well, I would have been a lot more annoyed at some of the writing, but because it was on audio, I was like, okay, this is fine. We're following along with 3 different viewpoints. The main character is someone who her older sister was like raped and murdered, and everybody kind of knows who did it, but he was never really brought to justice, and then he ended up dying, possibly murdered, but everyone's got their own little opinions on that. The author definitely made a lot of strong choices here, and the male POV was just awful. I hated everything about it, I think. I guess I'm supposed to have read him as like the hero, like a romantic lead, and I thought he was going to be the villain for a long time. My husband was also listening when I started it off because we were in the car together, and we did not like him at all. He thinks about sex way too much and objectifying women's bodies. It was really weird. And then the way that she wrapped up the book was a choice. That was super abrupt, and I guess we don't have to deal with any of the previous plot and consequences of that because now there's this whole big thing that just happened. And like, man, it was very engaging and easy to read. It had some interesting things to say, and definitely some plot points that I haven't read before, but let's just say that my cat ended up peeing on the book, and so I don't own it anymore, and I'm not necessarily upset about that. Into the final 3, and these are books that, I don't know, I'd have a hard time recommending. It definitely have to be to the right person. First is a 2.75 for A History of Wild Places. I think that this one had some interesting points for it. I don't like that it was labeled as a fantasy because the only fantastical element is, not a spoiler, it's in the synopsis, it's in the first chapter. There's a character who, when they touch objects, they can like psychically see the history and where people have been and gone with that object. It doesn't matter to the plot though, and it just isn't relevant in any way. What this really felt like was a fan fiction rewrite for M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. If you guys have ever seen that film, it really has the vibes of that. We've got like a weird cult, we've got people disappearing in the woods, we've got a bunch of villagers with like kind of outdated backwoodsy type of ideas, especially for living in the current modern era. And so it just felt like somebody liked a lot of the things that were going on there, but wanted to rewrite the characters and like the reasons for being and stuff. There are some mysterious elements that were like engaging but never came to fruition, so it ultimately felt very unsatisfying. And I think that the writing was fine, but I didn't enjoy this one, especially when I think about the end. I just like get kind of upset, like my time was wasted because the end was just crap. It was bad. So yeah, that was a book, I guess. I then gave a 2.5 to Keeper of the Night, but honestly I'm thinking about maybe lowering that even. It's a new YA. It's about a girl who is half Shinigami and half Reaper, so she's half Japanese and half English. She lives in England and she's always lived as a Reaper, but her whole society like hates her and they're always calling her Japanese, so in the back of her mind she's kind of like, I guess I might move to Japan someday, at least there I'd fit in. And the first half of the book is all in England and it's terrible. Like, I know that their society is a little bit more backwards and progresses more slowly because they live a really long time. She's basically a teenager in their world, but I think she's like over 100 years old. And so it's a lot harder for things to change, but that doesn't mean progress doesn't happen. And here they are, for an example. Every single day, the Reapers have to come and return all of the souls that they've harvested or whatever. And you have to do it by a certain time because it's very much in that like westernized office culture, you know, everything's on a time clock type of thing. And there's this guy in charge and he leaves her waiting in the lobby, and by the time he finally calls her back and checks in her souls, even though she was definitely there on time and early, by the time he checks her in, she's late. So he can mark her as late. And he did it intentionally because for some reason, just clowning on the teenager will gain him status and stuff at work, and he might even be able to get a promotion because everyone likes that he's mean to her. I don't know. It was super weird. And as a punishment, she has to like sit in the stocks for a day or a couple of days and people jeer and throw things at her. And it's like, what is this? What am I reading? What is this mustache twirling racism that doesn't exist in the modern day? Like, it's so hard to relate to that.
This was a supreme waste of time.
And so when she finally goes to Japan, it's a lot more interesting. It has different mythology and a different social structure and hierarchy and everything. There's different monsters, and I really liked learning about those. So I think that where the first book left off, the next book could actually be interesting, but this one was kind of all over the place. There's a heavy focus on like a romance subplot that then's kind of just discarded. There's really abrupt changes that were not set up at all at the end of the first book. And like, yeah, I don't trust the author based on this book alone, so I'm really not looking like even a vague interest in continuing on.
Disappointed!
And lastly and leastly is The Angel of El Khalili. This is the second prequel before Master of Jinn, and I didn't like this. I don't think it had anything to offer really. It's so bland and stereotypical that I forgot we were supposed to be in Egypt at all. It just reminded me of the same exact story that I've heard, but like from white women in the Industrial Revolution, like early 1900s. So having it here and having it be a younger girl and in Egypt, I guess, like there was no flavor, there was no interest, there was nothing that hadn't come up before. I just felt like I was reading a story I've read a million times. The only thing this has going for it is that cover art is gorgeous.
Stare at it and call it just gorgeous.
I love the colors, I love the scale, the size difference between the angel and the girl. I think it is so beautiful. Whoever made this art, excellent, excellent job. But the story is just trash. But those are all of the non-romance reads that I read in February. I would love to hear if you've read any of these books or intend to, especially those ones that I mentioned in the beginning. If you want me to further sell them on you, I am totally willing to do that. And I will see you guys in the next one.
Oh, hi.